There is a silence that follows betrayal, a silence not of peace but of collapse. It hums like the air after an explosion, invisible, yet thick with the dust of what once was. A woman sits in that silence, the breath trembling in her chest, eyes fixed on the fragments of a life that can no longer be assembled. But beneath the human scene, the heartbreak, the disbelief, something larger stirs. For betrayal is never just between two people. It is the soul confronting its own reflection. It is psyche meeting shadow in the dim corridor of the unconscious. Carl Jung once wrote that the modern relationship rarely happens between two whole beings. More often, it unfolds between two halves, each carrying ghosts, each seeking completion in the other's light. Infidelity, then, is not merely a moral failure. It is an eruption of what has long been buried. The man who cheats is not always hunting pleasure. He is searching for what he lost inside himself. And what he finds, briefly, is not love but anesthesia. He begins, as most do, with a mask. The world loves the mask, dependable, charming, kind. Jung called it the persona, the crafted face offered to society so one may belong. He learns early that to be loved he must be good, to be respected he must be strong, to be accepted he must be predictable. So he becomes the good man, the courteous one, the reliable one, the one who never falters. But every mask, if worn too long, fuses to the skin. Beneath its polish, another voice whispers, the outlawed one, the restless one, the child who still longs to run barefoot into danger. He hides that voice for years, until the hiding itself becomes unbearable. When the mask finally cracks, it is rarely dramatic. Sometimes it happens in a glance that awakens forgotten electricity, or in the dull ache of routine that feels like slow suffocation. He convinces himself it is chance, chemistry, destiny, anything but the truth. The persona has failed to contain the life beneath it. And so he crosses the line. In that act, he is not only betraying another person, he is betraying the illusion of himself. The cathedral of the self, carefully built with vows, duties, and roles, trembles, and a serpent stirs in its foundation. The serpent is not evil, it is instinct demanding to be acknowledged. For too long it has been chained under the altar of appearance. Now it coils upward, whispering, "Remember me." This serpent is the shadow, Jung's word for everything we reject within ourselves. Desire, rage, envy, tenderness, all banished into darkness. But what we repress does not die, it waits. And when the pressure becomes too great, the shadow does not politely knock, it breaks in. Infidelity becomes its language. The forbidden affair is not about another body, it is about touching the forgotten fire. For a moment he feels alive, unjudged, whole. But life borrowed from repression always demands repayment. Society calls him selfish. His partner calls him cruel. Yet in his secret heart, he does not feel powerful, he feels terrified. Because what has awakened inside him is no longer under control. The serpent of the unconscious has bitten through the bars, and he realizes too late that freedom without awareness is another kind of prison. He has tasted the forbidden, but not understood its purpose, to be integrated, not indulged. Once, long ago, men had rituals that taught them how to meet the shadow. They entered the forest alone, faced cold, hunger, fear. They learned to listen to the night and to the trembling of their own hands. But the modern man's initiation is digital and hollow. He scrolls instead of hunts, consumes instead of contemplates. He mistakes adrenaline for aliveness. Deprived of true trials, he invents artificial ones, the risk of the affair, the thrill of secrecy, the intoxication of deceit. It is the same archetypal hunger to prove oneself against danger, but turned inward against the sacred bond of trust. He mistakes rebellion for freedom, forgetting that the true task of manhood is not conquest, but integration. Without that initiation, the shadow governs him from below, a puppeteer of unmet needs. And beneath the shadow lies another figure, the anima, the inner feminine. Every man carries her, though most do not know her name. She is not a woman of flesh, but of dream, the voice that soothes, the gaze that redeems, the warmth that promises wholeness. When he meets an actual woman, he projects her image onto her face. He does not see her, he sees the reflection of his own forgotten soul. In the beginning, this projection feels like divinity. She is the answer, the muse, the salvation. But no mortal can sustain the weight of such worship. When the illusion breaks, when the dishes pile, when time erodes enchantment, he feels deceived. He confuses the collapse of projection with the failure of love. Unable to face that his anima was always within, he seeks a new vessel to carry the fantasy. Thus the cycle continues: projection, disillusionment, flight. He calls it passion, but it is spiritual evasion. In truth, he is not chasing women, he is chasing the ghost of his own completeness. The anima he refuses to integrate becomes a mirage across every horizon, forever glimpsed, never reached. And the women who love him become unwilling mirrors of his longing, bearing the ache of his unfinished psychology. There is a mirror deeper still, the mirror of Narcissus. In that reflection, he does not fall in love with the woman before him, but with the feeling of being desired by her. Her admiration patches his emptiness, her attention becomes oxygen. But when she demands truth instead of charm, he panics. He would rather shatter the mirror than watch the illusion fade. Cheating, then, is not about possession, but preservation, the desperate attempt to sustain an image of desirability in the face of mortality and monotony. He is not drunk on pleasure, but on validation. And so the mirror becomes a trap, every new reflection dimmer than the last, every conquest echoing the same hollow refrain, "See me, so I don't disappear." Underneath all of this moves the ego, the fragile architect trying to hold the facade together. The ego insists on narrative: I am good, I am in control, I am different. It edits memory, rationalizes impulses, rewrites failure as fate. But the ego cannot bear contradiction. When its story of virtue collides with the shadow's truth, it fractures. Rather than integrate, it justifies: it meant nothing, she drove me to it, I was lonely. Each justification is a brick sealing the labyrinth around him. He wanders those corridors believing he seeks freedom, yet every turn leads back to the same emptiness, the very void he was fleeing. The labyrinth is the perfect image of the unexamined psyche. It is built not of walls, but of denials, each turn a refusal to face the minotaur within. He mistakes motion for progress, repetition for renewal. But the exit exists only at the center, where the beast waits, the part of him he cannot love. Until he kneels before that creature and calls it brother, he will wander forever, carrying the torch of false beginnings. Listen closely to the silence before betrayal. It speaks of emotional illiteracy. He does not know the language of feeling. He was taught to fix, not to feel, to build, not to confess. When grief knocks, he changes the subject. When fear arises, he works harder. When love demands presence, he offers performance. His emotions pile up like letters never opened, each one heavier than the last. By the time the affair begins, he is already gone, vanished into the unsaid. Cheating becomes a primitive vocabulary for what he cannot articulate: I am lost, I am afraid, I am empty. But instead of speaking, he acts. Action, after all, is the only language he was ever allowed. Society calls this strength. It is not strength, it is silence wearing armor. And silence, when suffocated, turns toxic. It becomes deceit. It becomes betrayal. Not because he wishes to harm, but because he does not know another way to cry out. There is another archetype at play, the trickster. The eternal jester, the double-tongued god who laughs at rules. Every man carries a trace of him. When conscious, he brings play, wit, renewal. When unconscious, he becomes sabotage. The trickster delights in the forbidden, in the thrill of outsmarting consequence. He whispers, you can have both devotion and adventure, loyalty and lust. And the man believes him, because the trickster speaks in the voice of possibility. But each secret, each lie, weaves another thread in the web that eventually ensnares him. He begins to mistake duplicity for cleverness. He says, I am not hurting anyone. Yet every deception extracts a toll, not in punishment, but in fragmentation. His soul becomes a mosaic of relics, each shard reflecting a different face he has worn. He calls this complexity, but it is merely division. And the mosaic, when viewed from above, no longer forms an image, only scattered pieces glittering in dust. Culture applauds the trickster. He is charming in films, enviable among peers, forgiven in confessionals. We romanticize his chaos, calling it freedom. But what we celebrate publicly becomes what we internalize privately. And thus betrayal becomes a rite of passage, not a rupture. Men learn to sin with a wink, to laugh at conscience, to equate infidelity with vitality. Yet Jung warned that when society loses its reverence for the sacred, the shadow grows collectively. The laughter in locker rooms becomes the choir of a stone cathedral, echoing with hollow jokes that mask silent despair. Each jest is a hymn to avoidance. Each shrug an offering to emptiness. And there it is, emptiness, the quiet core beneath all the noise. It is not loneliness, it is disconnection from the soul. The man who cheats often discovers this void only afterward, in the stillness of what he destroyed. At first, he mistakes it for guilt. Then for freedom. Then, when the excitement fades, for nothing at all. He looks into the mirror and sees a stranger. The mirror does not judge, it simply reflects absence. He tries to fill it, new faces, new pursuits, but the void remains. Because what he abandoned was not a relationship. It was the living thread that tied him to meaning. Without it, he becomes an actor performing his own ghost. Jung called this soul loss, when the psyche's vital energy withdraws from the conscious self. In such men, joy turns mechanical. Achievement feels sterile. Pleasure tastes of ash. They have traded authenticity for control, truth for image, intimacy for repetition. And beneath the performance, the shadow feasts quietly, feeding on the very life he tries to protect. Yet within every collapse lies the seed of transformation. When the labyrinth walls finally crumble, when the serpent has shed its skin, when the mirror shows not beauty but truth, there, if he dares, begins redemption. For to see one's own darkness without fleeing is the birth of consciousness. If he can kneel amid the ruins and whisper, I am not who I thought I was, but I wish to know who I am, then the long road of individuation begins. It is not the road back to innocence, but forward to integration. He must gather the fragments of his mosaic and assemble them not into perfection, but into wholeness. This journey is brutal. He must face the anima not as fantasy, but as guide, learning tenderness without possession. He must befriend the shadow, transforming rage into courage, desire into presence. He must humble the ego, allowing truth to replace narrative. He must silence the trickster, not by repression, but by dialogue. And finally, he must step into the emptiness, not to fill it, but to dwell there until meaning grows naturally, like light returning through a cracked roof. For the woman who was betrayed, none of this erases pain. But it can reframe it. His betrayal was never proof of her inadequacy, it was evidence of his fragmentation. She was the mirror in which he glimpsed what he could not yet integrate: sincerity, stability, emotional depth. When he shattered that mirror, he was not destroying her worth, he was running from his own potential. To see this is not to excuse him. It is to reclaim oneself from the labyrinth of blame. Because healing does not begin when he apologizes. It begins when she understands that his act was not against her essence, but against his own unfinished soul. There will come a time, long after the noise has died, when she sits in quiet and feels something shift. The anger lessens. The questions dissolve. In their place arises a calm awareness that she stayed when he ran, that she faced pain without disguise, that she lived the initiation he avoided. Her suffering, once raw, becomes luminous. It teaches her discernment, boundaries, empathy without illusion. She learns that love is not about saving another from their darkness, but about honoring one's own light. In the ruins, she finds the foundation of a new cathedral, built not of promises, but of presence. And in that sacred space, forgiveness is no longer an obligation. It is simply what happens when understanding outgrows bitterness. The aftermath of betrayal is not measured in days, but in dimensions of silence. There is the silence between two people, the absence of speech, the avoidance of eyes. Then there is the deeper silence, the one that opens within the soul like a cave. It echoes not with the memory of the other, but with the faint question, who am I now? For when trust dies, the self it once held together dies with it. In that hollow, one either collapses or begins to listen. Because beneath the wreckage of loss, something ancient begins to speak, the voice that was always drowned by the noise of certainty. To face betrayal is to face death. Not the physical kind, but the death of identity. The man thought he was the good husband, the loyal partner, the one in control. The woman thought she was the beloved, the chosen, the safe one. Both identities fracture in the same moment. And from those cracks, the psyche demands rebirth. But rebirth, Jung reminds us, requires descent, a journey through the underworld of the self. This underworld is not hell, it is the unconscious. It contains every instinct, memory, and image that consciousness cannot yet bear. When life is stable, we build walls around it, calling them success, morality, normality. But betrayal smashes those walls, forcing the flood to rise. Dreams become vivid. Old wounds resurface. One feels haunted not by ghosts, but by one's own depth. It is terrifying, yet holy. For the unconscious is not a punishment, it is the soil of transformation. Every myth of descent, Persephone, Inanna, Orpheus, carries the same truth. Only by entering darkness does one earn the right to bring back the light. He too must descend. But most men flee that call. They distract themselves with noise, with new lovers, with work, with control. They tell themselves they've moved on, when in truth they've only moved sideways, endlessly orbiting the same wound. Because the shadow does not vanish when ignored, it grows roots. And those roots twist around every new attempt at love, strangling it slowly. The courageous man, the one who finally stops running, discovers that the real enemy was never the affair, nor the partner, nor even desire. It was unconsciousness itself. Every betrayal begins as unconsciousness, the failure to know one's own hunger, one's own loneliness, one's own fear. He betrayed not because he was evil, but because he was asleep. Now the awakening hurts like fire, because it burns the old self to ash. But in that fire lies the first true act of honesty. To look into the mirror and whisper, I did this, not fate, not her, not life. I did this because I was blind to myself. This confession is not self-hatred, it is birth. To own one's shadow is to reclaim one's soul. The serpent that once destroyed the garden becomes the teacher of renewal. Its venom, properly integrated, becomes medicine. The path upward is slow, spiral, never clean. He will stumble, deny, regress. At times he will long for the simplicity of ignorance, the comfort of persona, the thrill of illusion. But each return to darkness carries less temptation, more clarity. He begins to see the patterns not as fate, but as messages. The affairs, the lies, the masks, all were symbols of the same wound, the exile of the authentic self. He learns, gradually, that love without self-awareness is possession, and freedom without empathy is emptiness. He learns that the opposite of betrayal is not fidelity, but presence. To be truly present with oneself, with another, is the rarest form of devotion. Meanwhile, she too walks her own labyrinth. The betrayed woman, contrary to every cliché, is not a victim, she is an initiate. Pain drags her down, yes, but down is where the roots grow. At first, she rages. Then she mourns. Then something strange happens, she begins to see through him. Not as an act of superiority, but as clarity. She realizes that his infidelity was the symptom of a culture that teaches men to perform rather than to feel, to dominate rather than to integrate. She sees that she had been conditioned to play her role as well, the nurturer, the forgiver, the keeper of emotional order. Both were trapped in the same collective dream. When that dream shatters, she inherits the raw power of consciousness. It is a lonely inheritance, but it is also sacred. Through her grief, she encounters her own shadow, bitterness, pride, desire for vengeance. And if she can face those demons without letting them rule her, she becomes what the alchemists called the Sophia, the feminine wisdom, not naive, not cold, but radiant through suffering. Her heart no longer seeks to fix or to be fixed. It seeks only truth. And in that truth, she discovers something unbreakable, dignity born from darkness. In Jungian terms, both are now drawn into the process of individuation, the lifelong journey toward wholeness. It does not promise happiness, it promises authenticity. To individuate is to bring every fragment of the psyche into dialogue: shadow, anima, ego, instinct, reason, faith. It is to let no part of oneself remain exiled. For only the integrated self can love without projection. The man who has met his own anima no longer chases her through other bodies. He meets her in silence, in creativity, in vulnerability. The woman who has befriended her own animus no longer seeks validation through his recognition. She stands sovereign within herself. Together, if they ever meet again, they do not reenact romance. They perform a sacred dance of equals. No masks, no saviors, only consciousness. But individuation is not a one-time revelation. It unfolds like seasons. After fire comes ash. After ash, green shoots. He begins to rebuild life, but not in the old way. He works differently. He listens more. He allows silence. He learns that integrity is not perfection, but alignment, the quiet agreement between inner truth and outer action. He stops speaking in slogans, starts speaking from soul. Even small acts, how he apologizes, how he listens, how he chooses, become rituals of repair. He no longer seeks forgiveness as absolution, he seeks it as understanding. If she forgives, it is grace. If she doesn't, it is still his task to walk rightly. In time, he learns to love again, not because the wound is forgotten, but because it has become transparent. Through it, light passes differently. It bends, softens, warms. The very place where he broke becomes the aperture through which empathy flows. He can now meet others not from need, but from awareness. That is the quiet redemption of the conscious man, not to be flawless, but to be awake. Philosophers speak of the mirror of Narcissus, where one must learn to gaze without drowning. In his early life, he drowned, mistaking reflection for reality. Now he learns to look differently. He sees his flaws, his longings, his mortality, and he does not flinch. This is the new kind of beauty, the beauty of self-knowledge. For in the myth, Narcissus is not cursed for self-love, he is cursed for ignorance. He did not recognize the image as himself. Awakening, then, is simply to see one's reflection and whisper, "I know you." It is the beginning of compassion. Yet the most profound transformation occurs in the emptiness itself. The void he once feared becomes a space of peace. He learns that emptiness is not absence, it is potential. It is the uncarved marble before form, the silent breath before speech. In Eastern thought, it is sunyata, the fertile nothing from which all arises. In psychological terms, it is the psyche's resting ground. When desire quiets, when identity loosens, what remains is pure being. From that stillness, meaning is not manufactured, it emerges. He discovers that fulfillment was never in possession, but in presence. The same silence that once haunted him now becomes home. At this point, love changes form. It ceases to be a transaction, becomes transmission. It is no longer, "I need you to complete me," but "I see you as another expression of the same soul." In that seeing, betrayal loses its sting. Not because it was right, but because it was used. Every wound that becomes wisdom redeems itself. And perhaps that is the secret purpose of suffering, to force us toward a consciousness that comfort would never demand. When he meets her again, if he ever does, there may be no dramatic reunion. Maybe just a quiet nod, a shared silence, a subtle recognition that they were both instruments in each other's awakening. What once felt like tragedy now appears as initiation. For souls often wound each other in the process of becoming whole. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. They burned, they broke, and in that breaking, something invisible evolved. He is no longer the man who cheats. She is no longer the woman betrayed. They have outgrown those archetypes. They are simply two beings who have looked into the abyss and lived to speak its language. The labyrinth remains, but it is no longer a prison. It is the map of the soul, each corridor labeled with a lesson. Desire, fear, illusion, truth. He walks it not to escape, but to remember. Because consciousness, once awakened, cannot unknow itself. And so he walks slow, steady, aware, carrying within him the serpent, the mirror, the anima, the shadow. All reconciled, all alive. At the center of that labyrinth stands a mirror, but this time it does not reflect the old face. It shows light moving through transparency. It shows a man who has learned that to love is to risk dissolution, and that the only fidelity worth keeping is fidelity to truth. He smiles not with pride, but with peace. And in that quiet smile, the long cycle ends. Beyond the personal story lies the collective one. For every act of betrayal mirrors a culture that has betrayed its own soul, a society obsessed with image, consumption, distraction. We are all complicit in the forgetting. But when even one person dares to awaken, the collective shadow loses some of its power. The healed man becomes a carrier of consciousness. His presence, calm and unpretending, reminds others that there is another way to live, not through repression or indulgence, but through integration. And thus, what began as private failure becomes public medicine. This is how evolution happens, one honest psyche at a time. To those still walking through the ruins, be patient with your pain. It is not punishment, it is purification. When the mind screams, "I can't bear this," the soul whispers, "You already are." Let every tear carve awareness. Let every silence teach you how to listen. Let every loss return you to what cannot be lost. Because what remains after everything collapses is not nothing. It is the truth of who you are when there is no performance left to protect. That truth is terrifying. That truth is beautiful. That truth is freedom. And so the voice fades, not into conclusion, but into stillness, the kind that holds both sorrow and serenity. The labyrinth is quiet now. Somewhere within, a man breathes. Not hiding, not pretending, simply breathing. Around him, the dust of the old self settles like incense. Above him, the sky opens, vast, indifferent, eternal. And he realizes, with a clarity that feels like grace, he was never searching for another woman, another thrill, another life. He was searching for this, the moment when the self meets the soul and says, "Finally, I am home."